The way that you place less emphasis on Washington's authority isn't just through good politics and policy, and those are happening. It's by spending less time thinking about Washington.
We'll just dive into it. I have to say, DC, and I'm not tagging you as a DC man, but you're in DC, is overrun with what I would describe as policy light books. It is. Everybody's got one. And so, I had an expectation Don's Early Light would kind of be in that genre, and which was, gives me a little bit of a sad feeling about it. It's not at all. This is a very good book. I just want to get that out of the way at the beginning. It's actually
you seem so surprised, Josh Treviño.
I want to be clear that discovering that it was a good book actually made expectations and reality match. But I want to be the reason that I say that, and the reason that I share that up front. I mean, first of all, is and I'll say this again at the end. You should actually read this book. But the other part of it is, which was a surprise to me, but actually made the book what it is, and I think was necessary to what you wanted to do with the book. What I think you wanted to do with the book was how profoundly personal the book is. You tell your story in this book. I think that's the right place to start. Can you talk a little bit about why you didn't just write a policy book that everybody else in Washington, D.C. Would write? This is the font of your thought, which is rooted in your experience, which is an extraordinary story. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, and thanks, Josh, for reading it so closely, for not being disappointed in me, and for your friendship. And thank you all for being here. Look, I set out to write this book actually decidedly so that it would not be in that genre of books, because I know what you were thinking. This is exactly what the president of the Heritage Foundation will do. And it's going to be a book that talks about revitalizing federalism and implementing good policy in DC, et cetera, all of which are very good, by the way. But people say that. And I wanted to do something that was different. And so as I was working on this, and this book was hatched here at Texas Public Policy Foundation, I was encouraged by some friends and colleagues to talk about my upbringing, which was glorious and blessed in some respects because of my grandparents, to whom the book is dedicated. But it was not that as it related to difficulties in my parents' marriage. And the short version of the story, to give a little bit of a short version to a terrible tragedy, is that addiction in my family led to my brother, when he was 15 and I was 9, taking his own life. And that was 41 years ago, 1983. At the same time that my beloved hometown of Lafayette, Louisiana, truly one of the great places on planet Earth, a great place to grow up and be from, was experiencing nothing short of what I would call a Great Depression. And there were communities in Texas that felt this. If you grew up, especially in the Houston area, or Midland, or you're an Oklahoman, or you were working on an oil rig in Wyoming, you know what I'm talking about. It was like the stock market crash of 1929. And so that also was a tragedy and led, unfortunately, to very similar tragedies for other families. But those two things happened adjacent to one another. And the short version is twofold. The first is my grandparents saved me from all of that. Both of them were Marines, including my grandmother in World War II. I've talked a little bit about them on this stage over the years. She was 4'10", 95 pounds. Any kids in here? And she would whip your ass. I can say that firsthand, Josh Treviño.
I believe you.
But what a great, stable marriage. They basically helped to raise me. I have a great relationship, by the way, with my mom and dad. They're doing very well, and talk to them often. But then it was not great. But the second thing that saved me, and this is what informed my conservatism, was to the extent that government offers safety net programs that are temporary, that have accountability, that's good. I'm a conservative, not a libertarian, so I think that's good. And we relied on it. I got free lunch programs. We lived in a subsidized apartment for a few years. Life was not great, but government wasn't going to get me or anybody out of that. That was truly a safety net. Like you had fallen off the high wire and it saved you from crashing on the ground. What got me through that was a faith that my grandparents instilled in me, my grandfather in particular, native Cajun French speaker, serious Roman Catholic man, and Secondly, the community, extended family. Every culture has this, but in the Cajun culture, it's very profound because very few people leave Louisiana from South Louisiana. So all of that to say, I remember the morning after my brother passed away, being in the back seat of the car with my grandparents, and I had the most profound religious experience I've ever had, including up to this moment. And the Holy Spirit was there. And the Holy Spirit told me, keep the faith. You live in America. That's my conservatism. And so when J.D. Vance wrote his book, Hillbilly Elegy, and I saw him speak about it just a few blocks from here in Austin several years ago, I said, man, we had similar experience. Millions of Americans have had similar experience. Some of you in this theater, everyone has difficulties. The point of bringing in the personal story, which you know I'm a little loath to do, was not even to talk about myself, but to say, for every American who's discouraged about the American present and the American future, whatever the reason for that is, it's time to saddle up because we're going to take our country back.
Amen. You've got a passage in the book that kind of illuminates your point. You say, I didn't just want housing, I needed a home. I didn't just want food in my belly, I needed a provider, a father. I didn't just want an education, I needed a culture worth learning about. And I didn't just want a job, I needed a purpose. You're talking about things of the spirit. It's not a materialist conservatism. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, and you've been part of helping me to refine this as my career in public policy has evolved. And I really do mean that as a friend and a colleague and a great thinker. And the first is I realized material blessings are very good, but that's not the heart of conservatism. The free market's very, very important, don't get me wrong, but you only have a free market, for example, if you have good families, a stable society, and a government that reflects those virtues. And we don't have a free market in America today. It's an utter collusion between big government and big business and the gross kind of corporate welfare. And we'll come back to that, I'm sure, but all of that to say, as I was early in my academic career, and I kind of had to fly under the radar by letting my colleagues think that I was a libertarian who went to Catholic Mass often. I then realized, a lot of people think that I'm a libertarian. Now, I know a few of you in this room call yourself conservatarians. I don't mean any offense by this, just bear with me for a minute. The philosophical shortcoming of American libertarianism is that it's about the material. And it's about the freedom to do whatever the heck you want. And that's not what it's about. The good news is you hit a triple, and we're going to get you home. And home is conservatism properly understood with gratitude at the top, which then can be gratitude for both material and non-material things.
Well, talk to me a little bit about finding that gratitude. You had that moment in the car when you were 9, and that's one thing. But it's entirely possible to conceive of a life like the one that you have. I promise you, we'll move on past this. But it's such an interesting and I think important part of the book to understand. It's possible to live a life like that and to come out concluding that everything's terrible, right? And which a lot of people would. And I don't say that with condescension to those who do, because it's hard stuff to go through. How did you find and cultivate that gratitude as you grew, as you became a man, as you went through your own life with children and so on? It's a habit you have to develop. It's not something that comes to you as a grace, at least not in the long run.
That's right. Through examples of people, my grandparents, aunts and uncles, friends. I say something which is pretty provocative in the book about eliminating the Boy Scouts of America. Mm-hmm. As a proud Eagle Scout, that's hard for me to say. In the same way it was hard for my wife and me to pull our son out of his Boy Scout troop here in Central Texas when they decided to go irreparably down the path of wokeness. So much so, there's not even called the Boy Scouts of America anymore. And as I told a reporter earlier this afternoon who was scratching her head about this, nothing against girls. I've got 3 daughters, but this is a war on men.
Right.
And so all of those examples, scoutmasters, assistant scoutmasters, there were a lot of examples, a lot of witnesses. And that's what told me that at one of the foundational tenets of conservatism is a certain communitarian nature. Very different than communism, but communitarian in the sense that before we care about who we're voting for, we care about one another, we care about our neighbors, we care about community. A very recent example, and then I'll be quiet for now, is...
They're here to hear you, not me, so...
I don't know.
Please proceed.
I don't know. In Northern Virginia, where we are, you know, it's the Democrat base of Virginia. It's sort of hazard duty to be there. All of our neighbors are nice. The neighbors we're closest to definitely vote differently than Michelle and me. And they have become some of our better friends in Virginia. You know why? We talk about politics in the sense that you talk about current events. They know what I do. They really know what I do after this summer. And they still talk to us, and we still help one another out. And that's being a communitarian. That in that very small development, that what binds us together is so much more important than politics. Politics, very important. But I think conservatives, if we remember that, we will remember very naturally out of habit, that's actually how we undermine the power of Washington, is by emphasizing the power of our local communities.
Communitarianism, I want to dig down on that a little bit. You know, a good book review is worth its weight in gold, but book reviewers are some of the worst people out there. They really are. Speaking is one, because you know, you read a book without having done the work and the labor of writing a book, which is hard work. As you can attest, you've done. This is your third book, I think. It's counting your dissertation.
Yeah, first real book. The others were academic, and no one would want to read.
Well, that's fine. But you went through the work either way, even if it was a readership of two. So which is to say, though, when you find something, a reviewer will find something in a book and they'll say, "Aha." Like, that's interesting. And I did that when I read your book, because you talked about your Cajun background, very interesting genealogical, historical, which we won't go too much in depth to, although I'd be happy to inflict on that, all of you. But we won't do that here. But you talked about it, and I made a note when I was taking notes, because you mentioned, I'm paraphrasing here, but you mentioned that the specifically French and Cajun background that existed in southern Louisiana, which is where your roots are, was something that was expressive of and conducive to the type of conservatism that you're interested in, and that you espouse. I shouldn't say interested in. And the note that I made was this: can it be that Kevin does not know that the state of Louisiana tried to wipe out Cajun culture? And I thought that was going to be my aha. And then 100 pages later, there's about 10 pages on the time Louisiana tried to wipe out Cajun culture. So I should have known better. Like, that was good. But can you talk a little bit about that and how? And I really thought that this was actually a new twist for me, because essentially what happens is that it's the longs and the populists, the left populists who come in. They're essentially tyrannical, to use a modern term, and they decide to homogenize culture in Louisiana, including the families of your grandparents, wiping out Cajun culture, wiping out French language, and I personally had never thought of it before as an expression of that particular ideological bent. Can you talk a little bit about that, and maybe widen the aperture a bit to how government and the left now stamps out differences and heterogeneity among Americans, upon which our liberty depends?
I'll forget some of that question, so after a long-winded answer, you can remind me. No, great question. You know my limitations. I'll start with a story. That's probably the best way to explain this. I've loved politics since I was little, and I remember being at my grandparents' house, which was customary for me. And when my grandmother moved to South Louisiana from California, she and my grandfather got married out there when the World War II ended. They moved to Louisiana. She was from Illinois. And she married a native Cajun French speaker. And she was from a family of teachers, perfect Midwestern diction, married to a perfectly brilliant man, a good man, a great man, who didn't go to high school. And they had to be registered Democrats. I'm the first registered Republican in my Louisiana family. Not my Illinois family, but my Louisiana family. So I'm asking my grandparents, this is during Reagan's presidency, about politics, and we were doing Louisiana civics or whatever it was in middle school at the time. And I start quizzing my grandfather one night. I'm sure his patience was wearing thin. And I just learned about Huey Long, very famous, infamous governor, and one-time senator and governor at the same time of Louisiana. And I said, well, you must have just loved him. And he recoiled in his chair. And because we're in polite company, I won't repeat exactly what he said. He said, he was a crooked SOB, Kevin. It made no sense. Because as a native Louisianan, at that time, you had three things to be proud of: gumbo, LSU football, and Huey Long. And so the fact that he rejected that last one was like rejecting George Washington in a lot of respects. And then that's when I realized, oh my gosh, Huey Long was an anarcho-tyrannist.
Yeah.
He was like he was from the French Revolution, saying that essentially native culture, at least in that part of Louisiana, may not exist because it threatens the homogeneity we require in order to impose totalitarian control over you. And specifically what he did was disallowed the teaching of French, the speaking of French, Cajun French in the schools. The textbooks became homogenized. This ought to sound familiar 100 years later. Robin Lennon nodding her head, because this is what they do. But let me conclude this response, Josh, by saying this. I didn't think about that story until I started writing the book.
Really?
And it came back to me and I said, this is it. You talk about it being an aha moment for you. Mm-hmm. It was an aha moment for me. I said, this is it. This, at an early age, whatever I was, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, I realized government's pretty bad. Yeah. And Huey Long was awful. And when I went in to register as a Republican the day I turned 18, my grandparents called me and said, come pick us up. We want to go register too.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well done. Can we fast forward a century though, and
if we must,
you tell me. Oh no, I'm happy to stay in the past. Believe me. But you tell me if this is an inappropriate parallel. I mean, you think about the Trump coalition that won 2 weeks ago, which was incredibly heterogeneous, and ethnic minorities and cohorts that had voted Democrat for at least our lifetimes, right? I think about South Texas. I think about 25% of black males. I think about a variety of quote unquote ethnic voters and blocks up in the Northeast and the old blue wall, which is now a red wall. Is that expressive of the same kind of understanding that it's really liberty and conservatism that best protects the community?
It's so strikingly similar that there's nothing chaotic or disorienting about any of this realignment to me, nor is it to anyone in South Louisiana. Louisiana writ large, but especially South Louisiana, represented by the great member of Congress, Clay Higgins, who's eccentric in the way that South Louisiana people are. He's a perfect personification of this realignment, other than Trump and Vance. But let me tell you a story. 1992, I talk about this in the book, Pat Buchanan challenged George H.W. Bush for the presidency. And I felt a real connection with Buchanan's domestic policy ideology, a couple of critiques on the foreign policy, but he was the original culture warrior. And I was a high school senior. I helped organize his event at then Vermilionville in Lafayette, Louisiana. And it was the largest rally he had that entire year. And he got the highest percentage of vote in the primary challenge to Bush, not just in Louisiana, but in this 8-parish, 8-county region where I'm from. That 8-parish region, which has a lot of impoverished people of all racial backgrounds, a very large percentage of African Americans as well, who culturally, interestingly, are very similar to white Cajuns. You go look at the election results, it is Trump country. The parallels of this to Buchanan in 92, Reagan in 80, the rejection of the Long regime are all connected.
So we've established that there's a rootedness to this. I mean, if we include the expulsion of the Acadians, we've now ranged across 300 years of history. By the way, I just saw Javier Milei try to give a discourse on 5,000 years of history at Mar-a-Lago last week, which was cut off after about 15 minutes. So this is nothing, guys. But we've ranged on this, and it's so rooted. But if it's so rooted, why has movement conservatism only started to grapple with it in the modern era in the past 10 years?
Because what happens is movement conservatives go to Washington and they get corrupted. And a lot of them aren't movement conservatives to begin with. But the good news is, although it's taking a while, we are accelerating the percentage of Republican elected officials in DC who are part of this realignment. And Trump, of course, more than any other American in modern history, deserves credit for not only giving voice to that, Josh, but accelerating it, such that it is politically impossible not to be aligned with that now. You could not say that 6 weeks ago, because the chattering class, not just legacy media outlets who are liberal, but Republican officials in DC, senior officials, I can tell you firsthand, whispering, he's going to lose and we get to take control again.
Yeah.
This is what taking our country back looks like. And it's going to take another 10 or 15 or 20 years to complete this. Every realignment does. Do not be discouraged by what will be a little bit of choppiness as we get there. We're trusting our fellow Americans. We're trusting ourselves. And we're all limited, fallen in our human nature. It's going to be a little uneven, but remember where we're going by the end of the 2030s, I would argue, is a complete upending of the elite chattering class of the East Coast.
Yeah. You, in your critique of that DC Republican class, you quote Anton Chigurh.
That was for you.
If the rule, no, thank you. I appreciate that. I took it as such. Believe me. But he's got the quote for those of you who haven't seen it in No Country for Old Men, where he says, "If the rule that you followed brought you to this, of what good was the rule?" So I have a two-part question. One, and you'll remember both parts because one is very easy to answer. The first is why did they follow the rule? But before you answer that,
the establishment Republicans.
The establishment, correct? Yeah. Why did they follow the failed rule? And then the second question is, I saw Vance tweeted out the exact same Chigurh quote. So who gave it to whom?
Gosh, it's so difficult to answer seemingly innocuous questions these days. The first part, they followed the failed rule because of money and power. And so the way you break the habit of following bad, failed rules is to undermine the money and the power, which is what we're doing. It's what Donald Trump deserves tremendous credit for. But Trump would be the first to tell you it's what 80 million Americans deserve credit for. The second part of it is, I'm fairly certain this is the case. It went from me to him.
All right. We are on a live stream, so to say.
I will hear pretty soon if I'm wrong about that, but it's worth it.
Good. No, it's definitely one of the classics. Look, so the change is here, and I think we agree it's definitely generational. And the victory 2 weeks ago. We're a nonpartisan institution, by the way. I just want to be very clear about that. But the victory 2 weeks ago is proof that it wasn't a flash in the pan. That there wasn't 4 years of Trump, and then you go back to what it was. So, given that, are elections enough? What do Americans have to be doing to make sure that this is real and permanent, and not, for example, and this is no disparagement to anybody who participated in the Tea Parties, of whom I'm one back in the day, how is it not like the Tea Parties? How is it something that's going to last and change the country for the rest of the century?
One of the central claims in my book, as you know, Josh, is that elections are not enough. Politics is not enough in the way that we understand politics. Washington, of course, is not enough. It's enough to end ordered liberty in the United States. But let's just posit, and I think the following is likely, that the Trump-Vance administration in the first 12 or 18 months proves that they meant what they said, but that they've put the right people in place to go do the dismantling of the administrative state that we're all looking for, and that the House and Senate, even though that's going to be a little uneven, mostly are helping out with that, and it's going well. Even if that goes well, this is the point, it's not enough. Because the way that you place less emphasis on Washington's authority isn't just through good politics and policy, and those are happening. It's by spending less time thinking about Washington. One of the measures of success, and we're going to figure out how to do this algebra equation at Heritage one day, is when Americans wake up, like a vast majority of Americans wake up and say, I haven't watched a news segment about what's going on in Washington in a month. And maybe I paid attention to state politics. We'll definitely do that as I sit here at TPPF, especially the first 6 months of next year. But you get my point. Politics and elections are actually so unimportant to the real things we need to be focused on in our lives. Going back to the communitarian strand of our conversation, our own interior life, from which springs great relationships, friendships, marriages, children, grandchildren, great relationships with neighbors you might have political disagreements over. That's going to take two generations to regenerate, but it's the real thing that I focus on in the book. But what was the second part of your question?
Oh, the second part of the question was who gave who the quote. So, yeah,
okay.
Right, yeah.
I'm still good. I just had
right,
the recovering academic in me was thinking, oh, he asked me a second part of this. So what do? Yeah, spend some time on Washington, like the next 4, 5, 6 weeks, defend the cabinet appointments, put pressure on your members of the U.S. House and Senate to do the right thing, but really do, especially around the Thanksgiving table next week, and especially as we go into the entire Christmas season, not just the one day, give thanks to God and purposefully say, I'm going to start by spending 5 minutes less tomorrow on the news, and then 10 minutes, and then 30 minutes, and then an hour. And you will find, I can tell you from firsthand experience, from the president of the Heritage Foundation, the more you do that, the better this republic will be.
Amen. Amen. Look, this book is not an explicitly Catholic book, but your faith pervades it. I think it's fair to say. And one of the notes that I made in reading it, even though you don't mention it in the text, is the view of mankind and as espoused in Humanae Vitae pervades the work. Please Google that on your own time. But essentially this idea that we're bearers of dignity, right? And in addition to that, as the bearers of dignity, as created beings, whether you're Catholic or not, if you're religious of any kind, and it's something that the founders would have agreed with as well, that there is a proper ordering to life. Right, that there's a proper ordering to it, and we're not to do what we will, but we're to do what we ought. To quote Pope John Paul II at Camden Yards in 1995, that's what he tells the crowd there. Talk to us a little bit about that. What does ordered liberty look like in the way that you espouse and is set forth in your book, and why is it so important?
Well, two strands of thought there. One distinctly American, and another distinctly Christian. Even though Humanae Vitae obviously is a papal encyclical, so for our non-Catholic friends, I would still commend it to you. One of my new better friends in life, since I've been at Heritage, is Dr. Al Mohler. Great theologian, Southern Baptist. We're great friends. We talk very openly about, I'm not even say differences of theology, although that's what they are, but theological conversations. And I just invite you, if you're non-Catholic, or if you're like me, Catholic, and you didn't read it until an adult invited you, to do that, because it really does explain, and it's over 50 years old now, why we are where we are. All of that to say, that's one strand, and it's just part of my thinking. It's part of my understanding. It's not just my worldview. But the other is this equally important for us as Americans strand that comes from George Washington. Now, Washington was not known as an intellect, although he was a very bright man. He was not known as a voracious reader, although when he had time, he was. He was not known as someone given to really brilliant rhetorical flourishes. But occasionally he did, especially in private company. And one of the points he emphasized repeatedly in cabinet meetings, in letters, if you read his letters, especially when he was president, to some of his advisors, his cabinet colleagues, was this concept of ordered liberty, that the real promise of America, the real aspirational aim, was taking these two goods, liberty on one hand and order on the other, each of which we desire, we're actually hardwired to desire, and attempting to put them in balance. The British monarchy, it's parliamentary monarchy, at least in contemporary era of the American founding, was closest to that, but it didn't have as an explicit desire that. The point is, although we could talk about this for a while, the point is that when you do that as a polity, especially when you're so pluralistic, people from all kinds of backgrounds and languages and religious faiths, you're trying to do something in this life that's really noble. And so I would just encourage us, you can read more about the political philosophy, which is a very rich tradition, but just in a practical sense, are we as individuals saying that I don't just want to be free, but I want to be free the way the founder of our country and the way our Jewish and Christian theologians whose work helped found this country would want me to be free, which is not the freedom to do whatever the heck I want, but the freedom to do what I ought. From every small, tiny, minor decision which leads us, if we do that in excellence, to being given the opportunity by God to be part of something so much bigger than ourselves. That is the nobility of America, nothing else.
There's a collision course there that I think that's set up, and I'm interested to hear you talk about this, between that view, which I think you can describe as the founding view. I think that's very accurate. But the view of what I guess Virginia Postel would call the dynamists, right? The Silicon Valley types. I'm going to overgeneralize a little bit, but the individuals who believe in essentially unfettered experimentation, expansion of whatever powers they either generate or discover, and they're not reconcilable with each other in the long run. I don't think. To talk a little bit about that, because the reason I ask is that group is currently in the what's put in quotes the conservative coalition. Like they, and you can think of your rocket launching billionaire on your own, but they helped put us collectively over the top 2 weeks ago. How do you reconcile that tension?
Well, philosophically, those two positions are irreconcilable. Mm-hmm. And so I'll mention a couple of things. The first is sort of the tactical approach that I've chosen to take as the president of Heritage as it relates to that group of great Americans. And it is simply to be in conversation with them.
Yeah.
It sounds sort of goofy, but I can just tell you, full disclosure, as recently as 18 months ago, I thought being in conversation with them was a waste of time. Okay. Because of my own arrogance and saying, well, those things are irreconcilable. Why would we talk? Yeah, still a recovering academic. But they're great people. Now, in these conversations with them, I always have to remind them, I'm with you up until you start talking about Jupiter brain, like whatever that is. You might know what Jupiter brain is, but that scares the daylights out of me. But the fact that they're willing to talk to us, especially people of Christian faith, I think is very helpful. It's promising, not just politically, but maybe we get to reconcile that in a way we haven't yet figured out. But the other thing is, and I talk about them in the book, I never expected, Josh, as you know, to be such a friend of tech bros, but here I am.
Here you are.
And one of them is Mark Andreessen, who is, now that we're after the election, I can say has offered great feedback for me on where the conservative coalition needs to go. And he's very open to these conversations and ideas. That's how you take the brilliance of these men and women and their love for, being not just in conversation, but just totally mixing things up, questioning assumptions. Mm-hmm. This is why they're such great entrepreneurs, and saying, yeah, that's kind of what our founders did. And Mark Andreessen's got this great idea. I want to give him credit of a pincer movement, socially, beyond politics. On the one hand, this dynamic of these tech folks, mostly from Silicon Valley, but some in Austin, maybe some in this audience. And then those of us who believe that elites have been lying to us. And if you focus on those things, there's room for differences, even in legislation. And the rationale here, Josh, is let's work together and see where it ends up. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because we've tried everything else in America and it hasn't worked the last 15 or 20 years.
If the rule has brought you here. Yeah, very good. I want to go back to your mention of George Washington, and in the text you talk about Aeneas a few times. Aeneas fleeing from Troy to build to build Rome. Susan Hansen at the University of Dallas has a great talk in which she talks about Washington after the French and Indian War sends off to London. Have you seen this? And
I haven't seen it.
You haven't seen it. You spend less time on YouTube than I do, but I am watching Susan Hansen videos, so it's very wholesome. But she talks about George Washington orders a statue of the pious Aeneas when he's a young man. And so what it is, it's a statue of I forget the sculptor, it's an Italian Renaissance painting. He orders a copy of it. And it's Aeneas fleeing Troy, and he's carrying his father on his back, honoring the past, and he's holding his son by the hand, honoring the future. And that was Washington's understanding of veneration for tradition, but also education and the securing of the future. You talk a lot about education in this book. Tell me a little bit why you focus so much specifically on classical education in this work.
Because even if we have policy success in every other realm, taxation, foreign policy, whatever it may be, if we continue to allow education writ large in this country to deteriorate, all of that work is useless. Useless. Every person who's part of this conservative coalition or whatever Trumpian coalition must see himself or herself as an education reformer. And as important as it is to deliver an updated, modern vehicle, like imagine this revolutionary concept, giving parents 100% discretion on where they send their kids to school. God bless TPPF for being the leading organization for universal school choice in this country. Even when we get that, not if we get that, when we get that, that's still not enough. And that's a recognition that we at on the executive team at TPPF discovered 4, 5, 6 years ago, whenever it was. We had a little more time for meetings during COVID. We refused to shut down. But we would talk every day, and we realized we've got to do more work on curriculum. We've got to do more work. Once we secure that delivery vehicle of universal school choice, we need to make sure that we are regenerating the intellectual tradition that founded this country, because if you don't do that, you will never understand liberty the way our founders did. You'll never understand order the way our founders did. And it doesn't require you to subscribe to one religious faith or another, but it at least requires you to respect them, because that's what's required of an American citizen. That is the biggest challenge we have, is convincing people on our side politically that it's just not enough to get everything right about universal school choice and then you can stop. But you also have to pay attention to curriculum. The good news is individual Americans, people in local communities, all kinds of schools, from public charter schools to classical schools of faith, classical schools of no faith, they're ahead of the policymakers, and they're giving us the indication of where the American people are. I think by 2050, Josh, a vast majority of kids, of school children in the United States will be in a great books classical school.
Amen. Let's hope. I want to do a little bit of a pivot. One of the great unsung Americans of our time, I think, is your chief of staff, Wes Coopersmith, who I love.
That is correct.
My last, Wes, if you're watching out there, hello.
He's so tired of listening to me talk. I don't think he's watching, but he'll watch now. And a TPPF alumnus.
He wouldn't be in this job if he was tired of hearing you talk. So, but my last text exchange with Wes, I assume that you and Wes have the same opinions on policy matters almost all the time.
It is his job to agree with me, so
correct,
he'd be
yes.
better. Yeah.
So I say that by way of preface. The last time I had a text exchange with Wes, we were discussing Ukraine, and Wes ended it with just a bunch of thumbs down emojis to my opinions. And so with all that as preface, when I read the Ukraine portion of your book, it was extremely reasonable. You
seem surprised once again.
No. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that like condescending, like, oh, Kevin, you happened to get it right. No. But what I thought was notable about it, in all seriousness, was that it was well told in a way that even if you didn't agree with it, it was. I mean, I say this to somebody again. I think you and I have differences on this particular policy area, but I thought it was exceptionally well stated, and it was something I read it and I thought, man, I wish this characterized the discourse in D.C. It doesn't characterize the discourse in D.C. You've come under a lot of flack on this issue in particular, which I think we covered this a little bit at Visionaries, but it really seems to spark a pretty uncharitable and hard reaction from a lot of individuals. Why is that? I've asked you this before, but I think it's useful for this audience to understand what is so central about this particular topic, and I mean national security writ large, of which Ukraine is one central facet that brings out the venom in the political class.
The charitable way to respond to that, and I'll give you the uncharitable, or at least the realistic version, but there are several thoughtful people in this first category in D.C., is that they are today where I was and most political conservatives were on national security and foreign policy, which is to say they've not yet fully grappled with the reality that a generation of, and I don't mean this pejoratively, I mean it to be descriptive, a generation of neoconservative foreign policy interventionism has damaged the world. It's damaged the credibility of the United States, and most of all, it's damaged Americans. Even if we were to posit, which I no longer do, that all of that was well-intentioned, some of it was, it's okay to say we made a mistake. And at Heritage, we have said that about our national security and foreign policy reset, which folks on the outside were trying to make a mess of, and it just never was internally. I'll come back to that in a minute. But we also updated our policy on China. We're a lot more hawkish on China. Two people deserve credit for that, by the way, at least in convincing me. Because I used to think, like probably most conservatives, well, we're going to turn China into America, put more McDonald's. I mean, really. And two people convinced me that that wasn't going to happen. Donald Trump and Josh Treviño. So imagine, truly, imagine that we have the intellectual humility to say, while our principles never change, because we don't have power to change principles, maybe circumstances change. But the other category of people, this is where I insert my proverbial but completely genuinely intentioned bashing of K Street, is that there's too doggone much money invested in all of that eventualism. And until we break that, we can't even have more than 4 hours and 41 minutes after spending $200 billion on a war that the Ukrainians were never going to win. That doesn't mean that it was just for the Russians to invade, but at some point, on behalf of the American people, we have to be sober about things. Now, what I will say about you, about Chuck DeVore, about other great friends, we've always had behind the scenes and even publicly very thoughtful conversations about that. Ultimately, that's all Heritage is saying is, guys, let's talk about this. And if the American people say sending another $100 billion to Ukraine is a huge national American priority, let's do it. But guess what? They haven't.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think we're at Q&A time, aren't we? All right. So
you look
Q&A.
so enthusiastic about that.
He's very excited by it. So do we have microphones wandering? Okay, so raise your hand if you want to ask a question. However, there's one rule. You have to ask a question. So please ask a question. If it's more than 2 sentences, there may be something wrong with your premise. Go ahead. Please, sir. Go ahead. Yes?
I'm curious if you have encountered the idea, kind of like the award's too important to be left to generals. Maybe science education is too important to be left to academia in its current unreformed state. Do you have a sense that there is a national movement of people who are trying to jailbreak science education out of academia? Because if you have a sense about that, I want to talk to you about that. I run the Austin Science Network. It's what we're trying to do.
Short answer is yes, very interested in that conversation, and we've got an opportunity because so much of that, at least in the short term, needs to come top down from the education department. And one of the things that I think needs to happen before we eliminate it, root and branch, is to make sure that there are some executive orders that make that happen. So it's vital, most importantly, for the intellectual formation of every American school child, but it's also vital for national security, for tertiary interest, which would be economic and financial. It's really important that we do that.
Roger, go ahead.
Thank you. Kev, glad you're back in town. You may not know this, I'm a retired Army colonel. And if there's one thing those of us who were not in the Pentagon said, we used to say those guys in the Pentagon are idiots. How do we get around and start changing the people out there? Because when I look at who gets promoted out of the Pentagon, they're the same that's there. They're not the guys who are asking questions.
What a great question. It took moving to the DC area to learn that firsthand, especially during Heritage was the first mover on the political right in the DC to say the way we're going about funding Ukraine is not right. Most 3- and 4-star generals, to use them as an example, and of course we love and are grateful for their service, are the same men and women who told us that adopting wokeness and DEI was a higher priority than developing the most well-trained, lethal fighting force in the history of the world, which is what the objective of the Pentagon should be. And then some of them got so caught up in climate change hysteria, they said, we're going to defeat the Chinese Communist Party, our greatest, most existential threat in the history of this country, with electric-powered tanks. If those two examples don't suggest that appointing a rank-and-file, brilliant, well-educated, excellent at messaging secretary named Pete Hegseth isn't right, I don't know what does. And so I think you're already going to see, although the powers that be will try to fudge the numbers, even before he has confirmation hearings, I think you're going to see recruitment tick up. That's a real threat to us in ways that you understand better than most.
Anyone else? Go ahead.
So Kevin, not having read the book yet, if we fast forward a year and you look back in terms of Trump and Vance's ability to dismantle the deep state, how effective can they do that? What are some of the techniques? I mean, it seems like such an intractable problem.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Look, they've got to move quickly, and they are, on closing the border, on addressing lawlessness, not just there, but in many American cities, including this formerly great one we're sitting in now. They need to very quickly, which I believe they will, issue deregulatory orders on permitting for our energy industry, not just because that's right, but because it will benefit all Americans. Even before they take the oath of office, I'm convinced they're going to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. China's on notice. In other words, what I'm getting at, and I keep going through examples, but you get the point, is that they have to develop this head of steam on delivering on this momentum, on delivering on what caused the election to go favorably for them. And then the next thing is, and there are two more steps, how much will Congress be helpful in that regard? And it's going to require something even more important than great policy ideas and great people. And I know one place where you can go for those two things, and that is messaging. And so one of the many attributes of brilliance of President Trump's picks thus far is that every single one of them is great at media. That is not an accident. It is not an accident. And it's not because the legacy media says, oh, Trump just loves these auditions and the Apprentice stuff. No, he understands that's how he can sustain the popular will to do something he's going to get bashed over the head with every single day. And then the third thing is there's a whole bucket of longer term objectives we need to be thinking about. And we just need to keep as a tool in our toolbox some equally radical ideas that are very sound and legitimate, like the Convention of States. Just because Trump and Vance won doesn't mean that we should give up on that project. In fact, I am told by some Convention of State friends they're tuning in to the live stream, so thank you. But the points in Heritage, maybe having something to do with my being there the last few years, has become a sponsor of the Convention of States because we realize the objective isn't just short term, it's long term. And I know that President Trump and Vice President Vance are thinking about that.
One of the things that has come out since Election Day that was just sort of teased during the campaign is this Department of, or so-called, because it's not actually going to be part of the federal government, Department of Government Efficiency that Elon Musk and Vivek are going to do. Unfortunately, here in Texas, we have the cautionary example of the Sunset Commission, which seems to, having observed its operations now for the better part of a decade and a half, seems to more be the rubber stamp for the status quo commission. So how do you give what's going on with the DOGE, how do you give that some actual real teeth? And how does it not turn into what we've seen here in Texas?
Yeah, Adam, I think that's a fair characterization, succinctly on a really important point. If Vivek and Elon, in the recommendations they make, have success, which looks like, because there is no legally binding part of this, in cabinet secretaries adopting them and those programs becoming more efficient or being sunsetted, then I think you're going to see the political will that Trump has harnessed into turning that into having official teeth. But that also has a lot to do with this brilliant idea that Elon has, which is crowdsourcing the ideas for greater efficiency. That isn't important just in generating the list or sustaining popular will, but it's also very important in getting more Americans to have trust that this is even possible. Because if we get to 2029 and not enough of this has happened, the distrust of institutions in this country may be irreparably low.
Thank you for being here. What was it about Project 2025 that allowed it to be used? It served as a lightning rod for a lot of criticism from the left, and has the sort of discrediting of that in the popular media caused it to be not the guiding sort of outline for what you want to do?
Yeah, great question. If the radical left, which spent $76 million mischaracterizing that project, is the vampire, Project 2025 is the wooden stake in the heart of the vampire. And that's why they reacted like demons to it. And the political calculation that the president needed to make was fine. We talked about that, and I told him, sir, totally get it. Our point is this moment we have in the history of this coalition is so special that this has got to be done on such a scale that it made it more of a target. And ultimately, it failed. So I dare them to do it again.
Thank you so much for being here, number one. As a big, strong advocate for school choice, I've worked with the legislature for the last 3 sessions trying to get that passed. I want to bring to mind a very important quote from Daniel Webster, who talked about one of the primary goals of a public school education. He said that was to instill in children a love of country. And I think that is so important. And the other thing would be to actually have students pass Hillsdale College's Constitution 101 and 102 courses to graduate from high school. What are your thoughts on that?
I love both of those. What a wonderful reading of Webster, and I think you're totally right about Hillsdale and those exams.
Kevin and Josh, thank you for this thought-provoking conversation. What policy recommendations do you have to turn our universities around to focus on meritocracy again? From what I understand, especially some administrators try to hire more conservative faculty. However, they're facing, backlash and pushbacks from the current faculty.
Short of ending tenure, which would revitalize Western civilization, and I really do mean that, I think the right policy menu will be eliminating the Department of Education. That is, we mean that. We mean that. And look, if it's incremental and takes 10 years, that's fine. But where you have to start, and President Trump has been vocal about this and actually very articulate about this in a short video last week, is focusing on the money, not just the money that is through Title IV student loans and grant programs, not eliminating that, but certainly reforming it, but also the accreditation, because it's the accreditors, as you may know, who are sort of the third party that make all of the nonsense possible. And so I'll give you a very specific proposal that I can say still we at TPPF, I'm on the board, we worked on here, which was for the next time the Higher Education Reauthorization Act is up in front of Congress, and maybe the president wants to accelerate it before it's up, is to put in there an authorization for every state to authorize accrediting bodies. Because right now, all of the accreditors for colleges and universities have to be authorized by the U.S. Department of Education. Imagine if the 50 laboratories of democracy had their own accrediting criteria. Imagine if Mike Morath were in charge of that, instead of the goofballs who've been in charge of the Department of Education. Will there be some states like California that make ridiculous decisions? Yes, but it can't get any worse. And what's going to happen is a period of innovation that's tremendous. And I think you'll start to see over 20, 30, 40 years, real changes in the academy itself.
We have time for one more question.
A former colleague, Kathleen. There we
Hi,
go.
Kevin. How are you?
Great.
So you talked a lot so far about some of the policies that could be done at the federal level, but we are in Texas at the Texas Public Policy Foundation right before a session. And so I was hoping you can maybe articulate some aims that you think the legislature, either in this state or others, should take up in order to advance that cause.
Thanks so much for that. That's the most important arena of policy. And I say that not just because I'm at TPPF and worked here, but because it's right. And we at Heritage believe it's so right that we now have lobbying teams in 30 states, including this one. And we do that in a complementary fashion to TPPF. So Greg earlier said that I'm still kind of his boss. No, Greg tells me what to do in Texas. And I just say, yes, sir, truly, because he knows. But universal school choice, period. Universal school choice. There needs to be a continued reforming, to tell you something you don't know, you do know, and you don't necessarily need to hear. There needs to be a complete reforming of the property tax system in Texas. And the more that, and I can keep going on and on, Kathleen, as you know, but I'll conclude with this one. The more liberal mayors and county judges and county commissioners and superintendents are whining, the more you're over the target. It's sort of like the flack we took for Project 2025. You're only catching the flack when you're over the target. So TPPF has been a stalwart on all of those things and more. Keep focused on that, and that's what's going to keep Texas, Texas.
Amen. Kevin, thank you.
Thanks so much, Josh.
Well, I'll take the privilege of a few last words. There's lots of ordinary teachers out there, and I don't say that as disparagement to ordinary teachers. You know, Lincoln talked about God loves common-looking people because he made so many of them. But I will tell you, I think the mark of a great teacher is one who promotes heterogeneity and discussion and disputation, and when you're wrong, allows you to conclude that you're the one who's wrong, which is a dreadful feeling from somebody from South Texas. It doesn't come normally to us at all. But you know, having worked with and known Kevin Roberts for almost a decade now, actually, it's been quite a while. He is a great teacher. You know, I can think back to the many times that you and I had always collegial disputations, but afterwards, sometimes years afterwards, because I'm stubborn that way, I thought, you know, Kevin was probably
that makes
right
two
about
of us.
that. Yeah, no, I get it. Well, it's the haircut. That's what does it. But you know, when I think back to the things that you have taught me, you know, one of the big lessons, you know, I want to acknowledge this on stage and in public, was in the politics of the COVID pandemic, in which you were completely right from day one on that. And that's the kind of thing that I value so much about him, and I value so much about the book, because you're taking that teaching to America, and I'm glad. I think you're traveling all over the country talking about the book to a variety of different audiences, which is outstanding. So we're really privileged to have you here tonight. Thank you for returning to the source.
My pleasure. Thank you.
No, thank you. And everyone, would you please give Kevin Roberts one last round of applause? And one note before you rise to go. Yeah, you're going to be signing books. Is that right? He's going to be signing books. You should get the book. You should read it. Thank you all for coming. Good night. All right. Thanks. This is awesome. Yeah.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 10 million supporters of the Heritage Foundation. The executive producer is Crystal Kate Bonham. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, Tim Kennedy, and Joseph Fonsbakowski. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.